The smell of aviation fuel and fear hung thick in the cramped cockpit of my B-29 Superfortress as I stared out at the Pacific darkness below. It was March 9, 1945, and I was about to become part of the most devastating single air raid in human history. The target wasn't a military base or a factory complex. Tonight, we were going to burn Tokyo to the ground. My name is Captain Robert Dutch Harrison, and I've been flying bombing missions over Japan for 8 months now. I've seen Saipan, Iwo Jima, and the smoking ruins of a dozen Japanese cities from 25,000 feet. But nothing had prepared me for what General Curtis LeMay was asking us to do this night. As I ran through my pre-flight checklist aboard Sweet Caroline, my hands trembled slightly. Not from fear of the enemy, but from the weight of what was coming. The briefing 3 hours earlier had been unlike any other. LeMay himself had stood before us, his jaw set like granite, his eyes cold as winter steel. "Gentlemen," he had said, his voice cutting through the humid air of the Guam briefing room. "Tonight we're going to prove that strategic bombing can end this war without a costly invasion of Japan. We're going to hit Tokyo with everything we've got. 334 B-29 Superfortresses." That's what LeMay had assembled for Operation Meetinghouse, the largest bombing formation in history, carrying nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs. Not the high explosive ordnance we'd been dropping from high altitude, but a new kind of weapon designed specifically to create an inferno in Japan's paper and wood cities. I remember the intelligence officer spreading out the target maps, his pointer tracing the dense urban districts of Tokyo's east side. "The primary target zone covers approximately 15 square miles," he had explained. "Population density is roughly 100,000 people per square mile. Most structures are traditional Japanese construction, wood frame, paper walls, tile roofs. Extremely vulnerable to fire." The math was simple and terrible. 1.5 million civilians lived in our target area. Tonight, we were going to drop fire from the sky on all of them. As I fired up Sweet Caroline's 4 Radar 3,350 engines, the familiar roar filled my bones. Behind me, my crew of 10 men went through their own preparations. Sergeant Mike Sullivan, my bombardier, was checking his Norden bomb sight for the 100th time. Staff Sergeant Tony Ricci, our tail gunner, was running through his defensive positions. Each man knew his job, and each man knew that tonight was different. The formation took off in intervals, lifting into the star-filled Pacific night. LeMay had made a radical decision that still sent chills through the bomber crews. We were going in low. Instead of our usual bombing altitude of 25 to 30,000 feet, we would strike at just 5 to 7,000 feet above Tokyo. Lower than we'd ever flown over enemy territory. Low enough that Japanese anti-aircraft fire would be devastatingly accurate. Low enough that their fighters could catch us easily. But LeMay's reasoning was sound, even if it was terrifying. At low altitude, we could carry more bombs and hit our targets more precisely. The jet stream winds that had been throwing our high-altitude bombing runs off course wouldn't be a factor. And most importantly, the incendiary bombs would have maximum effect when dropped from lower altitude. As we flew northwest through the Pacific darkness, I couldn't stop thinking about the new ammunition we carried. The M69 incendiary cluster bombs were unlike anything we'd used before. Each cluster contained 38 individual bomblets filled with napalm gel. When the cluster opened, it would scatter these burning projectiles over a wide area, each one capable of starting multiple fires. The technical specifications were impressive. The human implications were staggering. "Pilot to crew," I announced over the intercom as we approached the Japanese coast. "We're about 20 minutes out from the target area. Intelligence reports minimal fighter activity, but expect heavy flak once we're over the city. Stay sharp." The response from my crew was professional and calm, but I could hear the tension in their voices. We'd all heard the stories about what happened to captured B-29 crews in Japan. The Japanese weren't following Geneva Convention protocols when it came to American airmen. Getting shot down over Tokyo wasn't just dangerous, it was likely a death sentence. The first thing I noticed as we approached the target was the wind. March in Japan brought strong gusts and unpredictable air currents, and tonight was no exception. Sweet Caroline bucketed and rolled as we hit the turbulent air over Tokyo Bay. Below us, the city spread out like a vast constellation, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. In a few hours, most of those lights would be fires. Bombardier to pilot, Sullivan's voice crackled through the intercom. "I've got the target zone in sight. Holy Mary, Mother of God, look at the size of it." I banked slightly to give him a better view. The target area was massive, a dense urban sprawl that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Narrow streets, packed neighborhoods, countless homes and businesses and schools and hospitals. All of it about to become a furnace. The first wave of bombers had already begun their runs. I could see the incendiary clusters blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness below. Each explosion sent hundreds of burning projectiles cascading down onto the wooden buildings, and within minutes, individual fires were beginning to merge into larger blazes. Whispered Ricci from the tail gun position. "It's like the whole city's starting to glow." He was right. The fires were spreading with terrifying speed through the densely packed neighborhoods. The traditional Japanese architecture that had evolved over centuries to withstand earthquakes was proving helpless against the scientific precision of American incendiary weapons. Paper walls, wooden frames, tatami mat floors, everything was fuel for the growing inferno. As we began our bombing run, I could see the other B-29s in our formation outlined against the flames below. The sight was both magnificent and horrible. These massive aircraft, each one a triumph of American engineering and industrial might, carrying destruction to a city that had never seen anything like it. "Bomb bay doors open," Sullivan announced. "Target in sight. Altitude 5,800 feet. Wind speed 15 knots from the southwest." The anti-aircraft fire was starting to intensify. Black puffs of smoke erupted around us as Japanese gunners found their range. A B-29 from the 497th Bombardment Group caught a direct hit about a mile to our left, its wing erupting in flames before it spiraled down into the inferno below. I watched it fall, thinking about the 11 men aboard, wondering if any of them would survive to be captured. "Bombs away." Sullivan's voice was sharp with concentration. I felt Sweet Caroline lift slightly as 2 tons of incendiary clusters dropped from our bomb bay. Below us, the projectiles fell like deadly rain, each one carrying its load of napalm gel and white phosphorus. The effect was immediate and devastating. The bombs hit a residential district that looked like it had been untouched by the war. Within seconds, dozens of fires erupted across several city blocks. I watched families running from their homes, tiny figures silhouetted against the growing flames. The fires were spreading so quickly that entire neighborhoods were becoming trapped. "Pilot to crew," I announced. "We're coming around for a second pass. Stay alert for fighters." But the Japanese fighter response was surprisingly light. Later, we would learn that most of their aircraft had been grounded by fuel shortages and mechanical problems. The few fighters that did challenge us were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of our formation. 334 B-29s was more than the entire remaining Japanese Air Force could handle. As we completed our second bombing run, the scene below had transformed into something from Dante's Inferno. The individual fires were merging into a massive firestorm that was generating its own weather patterns. Superheated air was rising from the burning city, creating powerful updrafts that tossed our heavy bombers around like toys. The thermal turbulence was so severe that several aircraft were nearly torn apart by the violent air currents. "My God," breathed Sullivan, staring down at the destruction. "The whole city's on fire." He wasn't exaggerating. The firestorm was now covering more than 16 square miles of Tokyo's most densely populated districts. Winds generated by the fire itself were reaching hurricane strength, feeding oxygen to the flames and spreading burning debris across vast areas. The temperature at ground level was exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to boil water instantly, hot enough to kill anyone caught in the open. From our altitude, we could see rivers of fire flowing down the streets as burning debris and superheated air created convection currents that carried the inferno in every direction. The Sumida River, which ran through the heart of the target area, was clogged with thousands of people who had jumped in seeking refuge from the flames. Many of them were being boiled alive as the water itself reached scalding temperatures. The sight was mesmerizing and horrifying. I had never seen destruction on this scale, and I don't think any human being in history had witnessed anything like it. The atomic bumps that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 months later would seem almost surgical in comparison. This was area destruction on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before. Navigator to pilot called out Lieutenant Jim Peterson. "We need to get out of here. The thermal updrafts are getting dangerous." He was right. Several B-29s had already been damaged by the violent air currents rising from the firestorm. The superheated air was creating wind shears and downdrafts that could tear an aircraft apart. But as we climbed away from the target area, I couldn't stop looking back at what we had created. The firestorm was visible from more than 100 miles away. A pillar of smoke and flame reaching up into the stratosphere, glowing like a second sun in the Pacific darkness. Radio reports from other aircraft in the formation confirmed that the fires were spreading far beyond our original target area. The winds were carrying burning debris for miles, igniting new fires in districts we hadn't even bombed. On the flight back to Guam, my crew was unusually quiet. The adrenaline of combat was wearing off, and the full implications of what we had done were starting to sink in. We had just participated in the most destructive single air raid in human history. In 3 hours, we had killed more people than either atomic bomb would claim. The exact number would never be known, but intelligence estimates suggested that between 80,000 and 100,000 civilians had died in the firestorm. "Pilot to crew," I announced as we approached our base. "I want everyone to understand something. What we did tonight was necessary to end this war. Every Japanese civilian who died in that firestorm means fewer American boys will die on the beaches of Japan. The invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost us 1 million casualties. Tonight, we may have saved those lives." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. The professional soldier in me understood the strategic logic. Japan's will to resist was being systematically destroyed by our bombing campaign. Their industrial capacity was being eliminated, their transportation networks were being severed, and their population was being demoralized. From a military perspective, the Tokyo firebombing was a complete success. The human being in me was struggling with different questions. I kept thinking about the families I had seen running from their homes, the children who had been caught in the firestorm, the hospitals and schools that had been incinerated along with everything else. War had always involved civilian casualties, but this was different. This was the deliberate targeting of a civilian population with weapons specifically designed to kill as many people as possible. As we touched down on Guam at dawn, I could see the smoke from Tokyo still rising on the horizon behind us. The fires were still burning, and they would continue to burn for days. 16 square miles of one of the world's largest cities had been reduced to ash and rubble in a single night. The Japanese government would later admit that the March 9th raid had been more devastating than any natural disaster in their history. General LeMay met us at the debriefing, his expression grim but satisfied. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've just changed the course of this war. The Japanese will never recover from what happened tonight. Their industrial capacity in the Tokyo area has been eliminated. Their transportation networks are severed. Most importantly, Their will to resist has been broken. The intelligence reports that came in over the following days confirmed LeMay's assessment. The Tokyo firebombing had destroyed 267,171 buildings across 15 square miles of the city. 22 industrial targets had been completely eliminated, including aircraft factories, engine plants, and electronics facilities. The human casualties were staggering, at least 100,000 dead, perhaps as many as 130,000, with another million left homeless. But the strategic effect was even more significant. The Japanese government's ability to continue the war was being systematically destroyed. Their air force was already crippled by fuel shortages and lack of trained pilots. Their navy was bottled up in port by American submarines and air attacks. Now, their industrial capacity was being eliminated city by city, fire by fire. The March 9th raid was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, LeMay's bombers would return to Tokyo repeatedly, as well as hitting Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, and dozens of other Japanese cities. By the end of the war, American B-29s had burned out more than 180 square miles of Japanese urban area. The cumulative effect was devastating. Japan's capacity to wage war was being reduced to ashes. I flew 12 more missions over Japan between March and August 1945, watching city after city disappear beneath our incendiary loads. Each raid was professionally executed, tactically successful, and strategically necessary. But I never forgot the night we burned Tokyo, and I never stopped thinking about the people who died in that firestorm. The Japanese surrender came on August 15, 1945. Just 5 months after the Tokyo raid. Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech specifically mentioned the new and most cruel bomb, referring to the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But many historians now believe that the conventional bombing campaign, and particularly the firebombing of Tokyo, was equally decisive in forcing Japan's surrender. The numbers tell the story. The Tokyo firebombing killed more people in a single night than either atomic bomb. The broader incendiary campaign destroyed more Japanese industrial capacity than any other military action of the war. By August 1945, Japan's ability to continue fighting had been eliminated not by invasion or atomic weapons, but by the systematic destruction of their cities from the air. As I look back on that night now, more than 70 years later, I still struggle with the moral complexity of what we did. We were fighting a war against a fanatical enemy who had shown no mercy to civilians in China, Southeast Asia, or the Pacific Islands. The Japanese military was preparing to fight to the death on their home islands, using civilians as human shields and sacrificing millions of their own people to avoid surrender. The invasion of Japan would have been a bloodbath that would have made D-Day look like a training exercise. In that context, the firebombing of Tokyo was not just militarily justified, it was morally necessary. Every Japanese civilian who died in that firestorm potentially saved the lives of American soldiers and Japanese civilians who would have died in an invasion. The strategic bombing campaign, brutal as it was, shortened the war and saved lives on both sides. But that analytical understanding doesn't make the memory easier to bear. I still dream about that night sometimes, about the fires spreading through the narrow streets of Tokyo, about the families running from their homes, about the children caught in the firestorm. War demands terrible choices, and the Tokyo firebombing was the most terrible choice of all. What I know for certain is that the men who flew with me that night were heroes. They carried out their mission with professional skill and personal courage, facing enemy fire and mechanical failures and the moral burden of what they were doing. They understood that they were fighting for something larger than themselves, for the survival of democracy, for the defeat of fascism, for the hope of a better world. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced aircraft of its time, a technological marvel that represented the pinnacle of American industrial and engineering capability. But it was just a machine. The real weapon was the men who flew it, the crews who maintained it, and the nation that built it. The Tokyo firebombing was a demonstration of American power and determination that the Japanese could not ignore. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of March 9, 1945. When democracy was threatened by totalitarianism, when civilization was under attack by barbarism, America found the strength and the will to do whatever was necessary to win. The cost was terrible, but the alternative would have been far worse. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was the fire that lit the path to peace. As I climbed out of Sweet Caroline that dawn in March 1945, I knew that I had been part of something that would be remembered forever. The Tokyo firebombing would go down in history as one of the most devastating military actions ever undertaken. But it would also be remembered as the night that America proved its power and its resolve, the night that marked the beginning of the end of World War II. The war in the Pacific would continue for 5 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan could not match American industrial capacity, American technological innovation, or American determination. The firebombing of Tokyo was the demonstration of that reality, written in flames across the night sky. Every veteran carries memories that shaped the rest of his life. For me, it will always be the night we burned Tokyo, the night that democracy proved it could be just as ruthless as totalitarianism when the survival of civilization was at stake. It was a terrible night, a necessary night, and a night that changed the world forever.